One autumn morning in 1945, while the silver mist still clung to the mountain ranges of Korea, the crowing of roosters and the pounding of rice mortars heralded the start of a new day. After 35 years under Japanese colonial rule, the people awoke with the belief that freedom had finally returned. Little did they know that thousands of miles away in cold conference rooms, a few indifferent strokes of a pen were silently slicing their homeland in two on a map. And from that very moment, the fate of millions would diverge along two paths, one heading north, the other south, separating them for a time unknown until they might meet again.
The article below has been compiled from many sources. If there are any mistakes, or if you know any interesting information, feel free to leave a comment so I can learn as well. Now, let's begin the article.
When allies became dividers. In August 1945, World War II came to a close amid the cheers of millions across the Korean Peninsula. They believed that after 35 years bowing under Japanese colonial rule, their homeland would finally be unified and free to determine its own destiny. But thousands of miles away, in the cold conference rooms of Washington and Moscow, the two victorious powers viewed the land through the lens of power. As the Soviet Red Army advanced from the north to disarm the Japanese forces, the American military moved in from the south. Neither side wanted the other to claim the entire peninsula. In a swift negotiation, U.S. officers proposed a temporary dividing line, the 38th parallel. This line, drawn without regard to mountains or rivers, was simply an indifferent stroke on a map, but Moscow accepted it immediately. And just like that, within hours, Korea was split in two without a single voice from its people being heard. At first, both the Soviet Union and the United States insisted this division was only a temporary measure to manage the Japanese surrender. Yet, temporary is a fragile concept in politics. Soon, the two occupation zones developed separate governments, military forces, and opposing ideologies. From a blue line on paper, the 38th parallel gradually became an invisible wall, then a physical barrier, dividing families, tearing apart villages, and opening a new chapter in history, a chapter of suspicion, hatred, and separation. Two governments, two ideals, two destinies. By 1948, after numerous stalled negotiations among the great powers, the 38th parallel was no longer a temporary line. In the South, backed by the United States, the Republic of Korea, South Korea, was established with Syngman Rhee as its first president. In the North, under Soviet influence, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, North Korea, was founded, with Kim Il-sung becoming the supreme leader. From then on, one nation, one language, and one shared history diverged onto two completely opposite paths. In Seoul, the new government sought to build a country modeled on Western-style democracy. In Pyongyang, a socialist regime took shape, anchored by military power and ideology. The border became more than just a line on a map. It turned into barbed wire fences, heavily guarded checkpoints, and angry eyes piercing through the early morning mist. Many villages were split in two, familiar roads suddenly blocked, and tens of thousands of families woke up one autumn morning to realize their loved ones were on the other side, possibly never to return. Both sides believed they were the true Korea, while labeling the other as traitors. Relentless propaganda, grand military parades, and fiery speeches deepened the divide. No one knew that just 2 years later, these tensions would explode into a blazing storm, engulfing the entire peninsula in smoke, gunfire, and bloodshed. The spark of war. On June 25, 1950, before the dawn could lift the thin mist lingering over the northern mountain ranges, the roar of artillery shattered the silence. Waves of cannon fire fell like massive hammer blows upon Seoul and the border towns. The North Korean army, equipped by the Soviet Union with T-34 tanks, heavy artillery, and modern infantry weapons, surged across the 38th parallel. They did not advance step by step, but charged forward like an iron flood, sweeping away the weak defensive posts of the South Korean forces. Seoul lay just over 50 kilometers from the border, turning the conflict into a deadly race. The hastily mobilized South Korean units, many soldiers barely dressed in new uniforms, were forced to retreat bit by bit under overwhelming pressure. The T-34 tanks crushed all barriers, artillery fired directly at critical bridges, and columns of North Korean infantry infiltrated narrow roads, planting red flags on newly captured positions. Within 3 days, Seoul fell. The capital city descended into chaos. The cries of civilians fleeing in panic mingled with the grinding tracks of tanks on asphalt, the smell of smoke and gunpowder blending into a haunting scent. The Han River, once peaceful, was now littered with collapsed bridges and boats desperately ferrying people across. Yet the nightmare did not end there. The North Korean forces continued sweeping southward, breaking all defensive lines. By mid-August, they had pushed South Korean troops and newly arrived United Nations forces into a small corner on the southeastern coast, the area known as the Pusan Perimeter. Here, the war's tension stretched like a taut string. On one side stood the desperate determination of South Korean soldiers and American, British, and Australian troops, backed by the sea to hold the last foothold. On the other side, the relentless force of North Korea, convinced that a final crushing blow would shatter all resistance. Battles at the Pusan perimeter raged day and night. The ground trembled beneath soldiers from relentless shelling. Each hill changed hands dozens of times in a week, sometimes within mere hours. Soldiers fought through blazing sun, heavy rain, and muddy trenches, often facing each other across narrow ditches, their battle cries and bayonet clashes echoing through the night. Just when it seemed the South was about to be wiped out, a daring plan by General Douglas MacArthur changed everything. And it was then that the name Incheon entered history, opening a whole new chapter in the war. Explosion. The Yellow Sea gleamed brightly under the dawn of September 15, 1950. Yet beneath its gentle waves, history was pounding the hearts of millions. On the decks of massive American naval warships, soldiers in life jackets gripped their M1 rifles tightly, eyes fixed on the distant shoreline, a place that, in a few hours, would transform into a hellscape of fire and bullets. This was Incheon, a small port seemingly insignificant, but in General Douglas MacArthur's bold calculation, it was the dagger poised to strike the flank of the Korean forces. On the horizon, a fleet of destroyers began roaring their artillery fire. Red flames tore through the morning mist. Shells whistled through the air and exploded on the shore, blasting apart bunkers and walls, turning the coastal streets into towering plumes of black smoke. The salty sea air mixed with the acrid smell of gunpowder, weighing heavily on the soldiers' chests. Landing crafts shook violently under the bombardment, skimming swiftly across the water, leaving white, frothy wakes behind. U.S., British and Australian Marines stood shoulder to shoulder, ready to charge into the death zone. On shore, Korean troops fought fiercely. Heavy machine guns ripped the sea's surface apart. Bullets splattered around the boats like predatory fish stalking prey. Yet one by one, the landing crafts pushed onto the shallow beach, doors flung open, shadows leaping down, wading through the cold water, advancing resolutely onto the shore. MacArthur, his silver hair fluttering in the wind, stood on the command ship, eyes unwavering on the battlefield. He knew that if this campaign failed, the entire Allied force might be driven off the Korean Peninsula. But he also knew that as long as Incheon's harbor was held today, the course of the war would turn. Amid the roar of naval guns and the battle cries, he saw the future tilting in his favor. The turning point of the battle. In less than 48 hours after the first tank tread of the American forces crushed the sands of Incheon, the battlefield's situation changed drastically. The Korean units along the coastal region shattered like glass under hammer blows. The makeshift defensive lines, hastily erected after many months of focusing on the southern campaign, were quickly crushed by the firepower and speed of the United Nations forces. From Incheon, the American and South Korean forces under General Douglas MacArthur advanced like a sharp dagger, piercing directly into the rear of the North Korean troops holding the southern peninsula. The Korean troops, who had been relentlessly pursuing toward Pusan, suddenly found themselves trapped in a pincer movement, one from the south pushing up and another striking down from Incheon. Along the dirt roads connecting Seoul to the southern front lines, convoy after convoy of North Korean transport vehicles and artillery were abandoned, burnt black and smoking. Groups of surviving soldiers fled in panic, many throwing away their weapons to escape. Seoul, which had only recently fallen to the North Korean army weeks before, became once again the target of a rapid counteroffensive, driven by the exhilaration of one side and the terror of the other. On September 22, 1950, before dawn's light had even touched the Han River, the ground trembled under artillery fire. The United Nations forces launched a full-scale assault on the capital Seoul. Intense barrages seemed to tear through the thin mist, raining down on the defensive positions of the North Koreans. From afar, billowing black smoke signaled a city about to be swallowed in flames. In the narrow streets, squads of American and South Korean soldiers advanced meter by meter, weaving through rubble and burnt-out buildings. Their opponents refused to retreat easily. North Korean troops turned every street corner, every house, into a stronghold of resistance. Machine gun fire whistled from second-story windows. Grenades rolled down from ruined rooftops. The battle turned into brutal, close-quarters combat. Daggers, pistols, even shovels were used when the distance narrowed to mere steps. Screams mixed with explosions. The smell of gunpowder mingled with the acrid stench of burning wood and concrete. Civilians trapped inside clung tightly to their children, ducked into shelters, praying for this nightmare to end soon. After 3 days of fierce fighting, the North Korean troops broke apart and retreated northward, exhausted and scattered. Night fell, and the highway leading to Pyongyang was packed with people and vehicles. Burnt-out tanks lay overturned by the roadside. Abandoned artillery and ammunition piled chaotically. The roar of United Nations bombers echoed through the night sky, streaks of fire lighting up as entire convoys were consumed in flames. Foot soldiers ran alongside trucks carrying wounded comrades. Many who couldn't keep up collapsed and were left behind. Small groups tried to hide in the forest, but the headlights of American jeeps and strafing gunfire from above turned the dark woods into a deadly hunting ground. At the rear lines, North Korean commanders received grim reports one after another. Key defensive positions had been breached, forward units cut off, communications disrupted. Some commanders were forced to order the destruction of bridges, roads, and supply depots to slow the United Nations' advance. But it seemed all they did was delay the inevitable. A relentless counteroffensive was about to crash down. At dawn on October 19, 1950, a thin mist hung like a veil over the hills north of the Taedong River. In the distance, the rumble of tank engines and the grinding of tracks grew louder and closer. Pyongyang's residents either hurriedly packed their belongings or bolted their doors, barely daring to peek outside, awaiting the unavoidable. Outside the city, the vanguard units of American and South Korean forces had closed in, with artillery pounding the last defensive strongholds. Thick columns of black smoke rose against the sky, mingling with the acrid smell of gunpowder and dust from crumbling walls. North Korean troops resisted weakly, small groups retreating through alleyways, abandoning trenches and weapons. At 10 a.m., the spearhead of the assault crossed the iron bridge spanning the Taedong River. The American Stars and Stripes flag and the South Korean Taegukgi flag fluttered side by side above the troops. Cheers mixed with sporadic gunfire rang through the streets, marking the moment Pyongyang officially fell into United Nations hands. In the Field Command Center, General MacArthur quietly studied the map. A significant portion of the objective had been achieved, but he knew the war was far from over. Across the border, a massive force was still waiting, ready to turn the tide. Shadows from the north, the surprise strike from the darkness. Just a few days after Pyongyang fell, secret reports from scouts along the Yalu River began to flood the United Nations command. In the cold mist of the border mountains, shadows of troops dressed in thick padded jackets and fur hats moved silently like white wolves on snow. They carried no heavy artillery, only rifles, grenades, and light backpacks. But their determined steps and cold, unwavering eyes made every intelligence officer uneasy. These were the Chinese Volunteer Forces, a name that sounded simple but concealed hundreds of thousands of soldiers ready to fight. They crossed the river under cover of night, using makeshift bridges and wooden rafts, taking great care not to be detected by reconnaissance planes. In the forests, they dug foxholes, made fires from wet wood to avoid smoke, ate dry rations, and drank from mountain streams, patiently waiting for the right moment to strike. On the night of October 25, 1950, darkness thickly blanketed the Chongchon River Valley. Temperatures plunged near freezing, and fog wrapped the hillsides, muffling and distorting every sound. In the forward camps of the United Nations, American, British, and South Korean soldiers lay in a rare silence, broken only by the wind and the creaking of wooden huts. Suddenly, from afar came the blast of brass horns, a strange and ancient sound echoing through the mist like the call of spirits. Before the sentries could raise the alarm, figures clad in white padded jackets surged forward like a tidal wave. Shouts of charge rang out in Mandarin, mixed with rifle fire and the sharp blasts of grenades. The American and Allied troops were stunned. They had no idea the Chinese forces had approached undetected by radar or air reconnaissance. The attacks came without tanks or heavy artillery, just waves of men flooding trenches, closing in to neutralize the enemy's superior firepower. Escape routes were cut off, communications jammed, and the cries and horn blasts echoed in soldiers' minds, making many feel as if they faced an army of ghosts. Within hours, the forward defensive lines of the United Nations were breached in several sectors. The news reached Seoul like a chilling slap, shattering illusions of a swift victory. On the battle maps, red arrows from the north began to spread, signaling a new phase, one the Americans would later call the Korean Nightmare. Frozen Hell. On the night of November 27th, as the moon dimly hid behind clouds, they launched their attack. The blasts of brass horns and battle drums shattered the darkness, followed by hundreds of rifle and machine gun bursts raining down from all directions. The American troops found themselves trapped in a pincer movement. Their artillery fire was insufficient to break through the layers of soldiers and snow, while the Chinese forces advanced step by step, making use of the mountainous terrain and the cover of night. Retreat routes quickly turned into battlefields. The bodies of soldiers, both American and Chinese, lay stiff in the freezing cold, many dying not from bullets, but from the biting frost. Supply convoys were ambushed. Trucks burned brightly amid the white snow, turning the chosen reservoir area into a nightmare of fire and blood. General Edward Almond, commander of the USX Corps, was forced to order a withdrawal, not an ordinary retreat, but a retrograde attack through encirclement, fighting while carving a bloody path forward. That retreat would become a legendary chapter in U.S. Marine Corps history, but also marked the first major victory for the Chinese army on Korean soil, stunning the entire world. From early December 1950, the front stretched hundreds of kilometers engulfed in smoke and fire. US, British, Canadian, Australian, and South Korean units were cut off, with many places completely losing contact. Towns just liberated weeks before fell again to Korean and Chinese forces overnight. The speed of their advance horrified many Western commanders, not because of overwhelming firepower, but because of their endurance and night-marching capabilities, a challenge the United Nations forces had never faced before. In Pyongyang, American and South Korean troops hastily retreated, leaving behind weapon depots, fuel supplies, and even heavy artillery pieces they couldn't evacuate. Chinese forces entered the capital with red flags waving in the cold wind, greeted by cheers from North Korean units. By the end of December, the entire front line had retreated southward past the 38th parallel. The offensive momentum was so strong that Western generals feared Seoul might fall for the second time. In Washington, President Truman convened an emergency meeting, while in Tokyo, General MacArthur began speaking of the risk of a larger war in Asia, alluding to the possibility of expanding the conflict into Chinese territory and even considering the use of nuclear weapons. The Life-or-Death Bottleneck. In January 1951, after Seoul fell for the second time, Wonju, a small town nestled in the mountainous central region of Korea, suddenly became a critical focal point. Whoever controlled Wonju would open the gateway to advance deep into the south or stop the opponent's offensive momentum. The United Nations forces, mainly American, French, and South Korean troops, established defensive lines here amidst freezing cold and muddy terrain. The wind howled through the mountain passes, carrying a biting chill so severe that even rifle lubricants froze. Many soldiers tucked their weapons inside their cloaks to keep them warm, ready to fire at a moment's notice. On January 7th, Chinese and North Korean forces launched a massive attack. The sound of bugles echoed from the mountainside, followed by hundreds of soldiers flooding down like a raging torrent. Artillery shells rained down on the town, smashing rooftops and turning streets into rubble. French units, renowned for their tenacity, defended every house and street corner, using machine guns and grenades to repel close-range assaults. The battle in Wonju dragged on for nearly a month. At times, the town changed hands multiple times within the same day. In the morning, it belonged to the communist forces. By afternoon, it was retaken by UN troops. Every inch of ground was paid for with blood. However, by early February, communist attacks began to falter. They had exhausted too many troops during continuous fighting in the freezing cold and faced severe supply shortages. On February 21, 1951, the United Nations launched Operation Killer. The goal was not to capture a large amount of territory immediately, but to crush the enemy's fighting capacity, push them away from the defensive line, and shatter their offensive will. Under heavy artillery cover, US, South Korean, and Allied infantry units advanced step by step across snow-covered hills. Ahead of them, Chinese and North Korean forces set up scattered strongpoints on the mountainside, stubbornly holding but poorly coordinated. Whenever a position was pulverized by artillery and bombs, UN troops promptly stormed to seize it, then pressed forward. Throughout the campaign, there were no more massive human waves like the month before. Instead, the communist forces gradually withdrew, fighting a delaying retreat to avoid annihilation. But it was this very retreat that paved the way for UN forces to advance deeper northward. By early March, UN attack columns had reached the Han River. Seoul, a city that had changed hands twice in less than a year, appeared again on the horizon, shrouded in smoke and ruin. Ridgway knew that retaking Seoul would not only have military significance, but would also deliver a huge morale boost to South Korea and allied nations. The battle for the capital was approaching. The City of Flags. On March 7, 1951, Operation Ripper officially began. The goal was clear: to strike directly at the enemy defensive line north of the Han River and open the path to Seoul. In the late winter sky, the roar of B-29 bombers and fighter planes tore through the air. Bombs rained down, ripping the ground apart, sending dust and explosions echoing among the ruined buildings. On the ground, United Nations forces advanced like pincers, cutting off the retreat routes of Chinese and North Korean troops. The defenders of Seoul were not numerous, but they held their ground fiercely. They used every pile of rubble, every intersection to place machine guns, set mines, and block the way. Every street became a trench. At night, flashes from firing positions flickered in the cold mist. The sounds of gunfire and battle cries merged into a sharp, resonant roar. On March 14th, after a week of fierce fighting, the flag of the Republic of Korea was raised over the ruined City Hall. Seoul, for the second time in less than 3 months, had changed hands again. Although the city was nearly exhausted, the news spread throughout the South, igniting hope that they could push the war beyond the southern side of the 38th parallel. In September 1951, the high and rugged mountains near the 38th parallel became the focus of one of the fiercest battles in the stalemate period. There, a peak was named coldly but hauntingly by UN forces, Heartbreak Ridge. This position was not a single hill, but a series of connected peaks forming a solid defensive wall for the Korean Chinese forces. From here, they could observe and control enemy supply routes. For the UN command, capturing Heartbreak Ridge was essential to advance even a few kilometers. On September 13th, the U.S. 2nd Infantry Division and French Foreign Legion forces launched the attack. Artillery roared for hours, turning the mountain slopes into a sea of smoke and rubble. But as infantry advanced, they faced dense firepower from machine guns, mortars, and defensive artillery of the Korean Chinese forces. Strong underground bunkers, deep within the mountains, allowed the enemy to survive bombardments and launch fierce counterattacks. The battle was fought inch by inch. By day, UN troops tried to advance. By night, Korean Chinese forces counterattacked to regain ground. Some positions changed hands 2 or 3 times within 24 hours. The cold autumn rain mixed with mud made every step feel as heavy as lead. After nearly a month, on October 15th, UN forces finally captured most of Heartbreak Ridge. But this victory came at a terrible cost. More than 3,700 casualties for the American-French side, and an estimated 25,000 for the Korean-Chinese side. The name Heartbreak belonged not only to the soldiers who set foot there, but also to the families on both sides who lost loved ones forever. And bitterly, despite capturing the hill, the front line barely changed. Signing of the Armistice Agreement, the legacy of a divided Korean peninsula. On July 27, 1953, after more than 2 years of tense negotiations, the Armistice Agreement was finally signed at Panmunjom. Although it did not officially end the war with a peace treaty, this document temporarily halted the bloodiest modern conflict on the Korean Peninsula. Both sides agreed to establish a demilitarized zone, DMZ, approximately 4 kilometers wide running along the 38th parallel, turning this area into one of the most heavily secured zones and a buffer separating North and South Korea. Yet instead of healing, this invisible wall became like a scar that would never fully heal, tightly maintaining political, social, and familial divisions for decades afterward. The war left millions dead, wounded, and missing, towns and villages devastated, and above all, a deep pain that divided 2 peoples sharing the same bloodline and history. South Korea and North Korea entered a prolonged Cold War confrontation, while the world watched anxiously each tense move in the region. But in the memories of those who lived and fought through those days, the story is not just about a senseless war. It is a story of resilience, sacrifice, and a faint hope. The hope for a day when the Korean Peninsula might truly reunite, overcoming the shadows of the past.
Thank you all for following and listening. If you enjoyed and found it interesting, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell to stay tuned for our upcoming videos.